Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show how I painted this dolphin in acrylics. Now this video is going to have lots of tips on how to blend acrylics, from starting with the water all the way to those final layers of the dolphin. It's a technique here that's required from start to finish. So my first tip here is to start off with some kind of colour rather than trying to blend straight on top of the white canvas. This just makes it a bit easier that we're not fighting with that bright white from those early stages. So because of the colour of the water, I have just gone for this with a mid-tone blue. And it might be that this foundation requires 2 or 3 layers. You don't have to worry about mixing the exact colour for each layer, but it might be that it takes that amount of paint to cover that white entirely. This might also depend on the consistency of the paint. If you've got a little bit too much water, you are going to have more of those brush strokes visible. So either work with a bit of a thicker paint and make sure you're using enough paint on your brush. That's also important. And if you do need to work with 2 or 3 layers to get to this current result, then of course that's fine. You want to make sure that this is completely dry then before you start working with the layers on top. Now, one of the wonderful things about working with acrylics is their faster drying time because we can progress through the layers quicker. However, that can make blending acrylics far harder. Now, I like to work with a few different approaches, and that's going to depend on how much blend I need, the size of the painting, and just here what I feel I can cope with at that one layer. If I feel I'm working with more of a complex section, such as this water, there's quite a bit of movement here, then I might want to work with more of a controlled blending approach rather than working strictly one wet layer on top of another wet layer and then trying to fight with that drying time. Whereas here you can see that I'm working in small sections, and then each of the edges of those sections I'm blending individually. The top part of this painting has already begun to dry, but it's already soft, so I don't really need to worry about that at the moment. Now, working with a smaller section and then only blending those areas at that time just then means that we can really simplify this blending technique. And as I say, this is going to vary depending on what it is and the effect that we're trying to create. If we're going with something super blurry, then you will need to work with more of a larger area, one layer at a time. And I've got videos here on YouTube that show the different approach for that. One of which is certainly using a fine mist spray bottle, and you will spray that water on your canvas to prevent that layer of paint from drying. But as I've mentioned, I do have videos here showing that, and I'll link those in the description below if they're of interest. So as I'm starting to work with the next stage, this is where I'm beginning to refine the layer underneath. I don't want the water to be too soft because it's going to look very out of focus. The top portion should be a little bit more softer than the bottom because I want to give that impression of perspective and that it is drifting a bit further away from the camera. But I do want to be making sure here that I don't overblend. Now, overblending can happen, especially as we start to get more confident with the blending techniques that we're using. If we start to move the softer makeup brushes, then we are going to end up with those edges of the light paint into the dark paint getting far too smudged. So we do want to be making sure that we are being aware of that. Now, when I'm starting to work with the layering process here, I'm not worried about the exact colour at all. I can work with glazes later on, and you'll see that in this video. At this stage, I can just focus on my values and building up my lights and my darks. The colour can be applied with the use of glazes so that we then don't have that pressure and that thought process at this time. We've got enough to think about with how to blend the acrylics without worrying about mixing the exact colour as well. When I work on the dolphin, you're going to see that I'm drastically changing the colour of that. It's going to be more work than just using a few glazes that I use for the water, but again, I will cover that in this video. It's really a great way to be reassured in that layering process that if we do paint the wrong colour, it really doesn't matter. We can fix it, and again, that's another amazing benefit of working with acrylics. So as I'm using the different brushes, I've now switched over to a rigger brush. I'm using the same makeup brush to blend my edges and get that softness without now making sure that I don't lose too much of that definition. Now, for the most part up to this stage, I have used a combination of brushes where I've maybe got a couple of different bluer values, maybe a darker blue, a mid blue and a lighter blue. I'm applying that paint and then I'm using my small makeup brush to soften those edges. Now, one reason I like to use this approach is that I don't then have to have one brush where I'm mixing the paint on my palette. I then have to think, well, now the water's lighter, I'm going to quickly mix that paint, add a little bit more white, for example, and then come back with that one brush. Because by the time I've adjusted that colour on my palette, the paint on my canvas has been given a chance to dry. Also, if it starts to get a little bit tacky, it might still feel a bit wet, but it has started to dry. The paint can actually then lift in chunks. You can actually then create more of a textured look to that blend, and that's where that paint has started to dry. So working with multiple brushes where you don't have to change those colours in between can help eliminate that problem entirely. That on its own can make a big difference when blending acrylics. Now, this one specific technique and approach is what I cover in this video from start to finish. It's a tutorial that is recorded in real time with a voiceover while I'm painting, so I'm able to explain every part of that process thoroughly. Now, when I am working here, I'm starting to work with a little bit more softness, and I need that paint to have a bit of a slower drying time. So here you can add water to your canvas first, then add your paint, and then blend with your makeup brush. This is one way to extend that drying time. Now, as I mentioned, at the top section here, I am trying to get more of a softer look, so I'm going to be using my makeup brush a little bit more often. But one thing here is when I am applying the paint, I've switched to this rigger brush so that I don't create brush strokes that are too thick. In between my highlights, if I am using a larger brush, it will be a filbert, and that there just means I can then get a variation in the thickness of those midtones and highlights, so that all of my highlights don't look the same. The rigger brush there has that ability to create those finer lines or smaller dots, and I am also going to be using that later on when I add the shimmer to that water. But before I add those details, I do want to make sure that I've got the blend and desired softness right. If I start adding too much detail now at these early stages, then I'm not going to want to blend over the top because I'm going to cover up those details. It can limit that layering process. And at this stage here, this water is not finished at all. I'm actually going to come back at the end of this video once the dolphin is painted and then finish this water off entirely. I'm going to add the colour that I want to be reflected into the water. I'm going to add those little sparkly bits as I've mentioned, and I'm going to really just enhance this depth massively. So that's going to be shown at the end of this video. So when it came to working on the dolphin, at this base layer stage, I do end up adding far too much red and purple colours to this mix. Now this isn't ideal, it does mean I have to take that time later on to adjust the colour, but it does prove that anything can be fixed. We don't have to start a painting again. And I do speak to a lot of artists about that worry of knowing what colour to use at each stage. And this is a great demonstration that it really doesn't matter. I'm able to adjust the colour of this dolphin later on, but here I still want to be focusing on blending and softness. This really is going to be something that shines through regardless of the colour that I'm using. So when I am working with these colours, I'm noticing where the shadows and the highlights hit that area of the dolphin because the placement of those is not random. Here, for example, this is hinting almost at the very back of the skull where it attaches to the body. The bright reflection on the top of the face, that's going to show how the angle of the head is sloped over. The highlight under the eye that I'm working on now, this is hinting at the eye socket. Everything here with the placement of my lights and my darks is what I'm focusing on at this base layer stage with the softness and that blending as I've mentioned. It's not the colour at all. The other thing as well to think of here is because water is very reflective, if this was more of a sunset, sunrise, then the colour of that dolphin is going to be different. It's not going to have that standard silver grey that we might think of. So the way that the colour is reflected into the dolphin does need to be thought about here. And I would always add glazes of the background, in this case the water, into my subject anyway. So I knew I was going to be adjusting the colour, I just didn't realise how much I was going to have to change that. Now, in my real-time tutorials, I never leave any section of the lessons out. Regardless if I have made a mistake, I've added too much of a specific colour, whether or not a selection of details isn't quite what I anticipated, I always show how to fix it. Now these mistakes, they do make us better artists. We are able to then learn from that, so the next painting we're less likely to make that same mistake. And I always want to be including as much information as I can in my lessons, and that here is an important part of it for me. If this real-time lesson is of interest, I will link the information to that in the description below. One possible problem that we can run into when we're blending acrylics is that when we apply the paint, so I'm using the same approach here, I'm using either a brush or my spray bottle to get the layer wet, get that painting wet. Then I'm using a separate brush, in this case at the moment it's a filbert, where I'm applying the paint, and then I'm using a small makeup brush to blend the paint. One issue that can arise from this is if we don't have enough of the wetter area in first, and I apply the paint, and as I blend it with my makeup brush, it then spreads up to the area of the canvas that's dry. What can happen here is you'll end up with like a lighter halo around that area of paint, and that is just where that wet paint has got stuck. It's hit that dry area and it's got nothing left that it can blend into. So one of my biggest tips, if you are using these techniques that I'm mentioning here and that I'm demonstrating, is that make sure you've got enough of that wetter area in first. All that will happen here is that water will evaporate and dry. So you're not going to disturb anything if you add too much water over an area where you don't need to blend. It's better to do that and be a little bit more cautious. It can really help simplify these blending techniques here. But one thing regarding that technique, if you are using the damp brush or spraying water, first of all, you do want to be making sure that that painting is completely dry in that area. Otherwise, you're going to lift up those wet layers of paint and then you're not going to be able to blend at all. So that really is something very important to remember. So these current steps, these glazes that I'm now using, this is what I would say are more minor changes. So if I was only trying to adjust that fur, feathers, the dolphin, whatever it may be, more subtly, then these typical glazes, and I've got lots of videos here on YouTube that show that this is the approach that I would use. And you can see that I am getting a little bit more of this darker purple, bluer tint to the dolphin. However, I really wanted to push this further, and I did decide to capture more of that silver grey. But one thing that was really important for me is that I also started to adjust the water as well, because the water is going to impact what colour I wanted the dolphin to be. So once I've worked with these turquoise glazes here, I then actually decided to add a little bit more depth to the water. I'm going to lighten some areas, and I am going to work with glazes there as well. The reason being, I didn't ever want to sort of hit that situation where I then adjusted the colour of the dolphin and then it didn't work with what I wanted for the water. So this is why I am actually now starting to work on more of one layer at a time. I'm starting to adjust the dolphin and the water together so that I don't have a painting that looks disjointed. I would never normally work on such a larger area, but for this specific scenario where the water reflection impacts the colour of the dolphin, working on both of them at the same time can be beneficial. Now, if I was starting to get overwhelmed, then I can go back to working in smaller sections. I can just have one area of the water that's my main focus. And another tip regarding the blending here, and if I was starting to get overwhelmed, is I also like to try to pick some smaller brushes, because with that feeling of stress and that anxiety, it can be tempting to use a brush that's too big, and then we start blocking in too much of the layers underneath and covering that up completely. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, every single layer that I'm adding here, even if I am working with 20, 30 layers, is that I still want the foundation to still be visible. I'm never blocking in over the top 100%, and this is why I like to build my layers up in this way. So once I'd taken that time to adjust the water a little bit more, I'm then coming back in with more of the blue glazes. And this is going to end up then too blue, because I'm going to try to cover up more of that darker pink purple and then pull in some more of the greys. And with anything, there are many different ways to get to the same end. So I could have worked with more of an opaque layer and painted over some of those areas completely. But I didn't want to lose out on that blending that I'd already established. The bulk of that is still showing through even at the end of the finished result. So here, if I can break this up into 1, focusing on my blending, 2, adjusting the colour, and then coming back in and adjusting my contrast, I'm able to then simplify that yet again. Those 3 stages, I'm not having to then get confused and do all of them at the same time. This is also where I'm now starting to adjust the colour of the water. And you will see here that I switch between the dolphin and the water. I'll go back to the dolphin, back to the water, which also helps with that mental process of working on something that's as complex as this. If I feel like each area, I'm slowly getting that more to how I want it to look without that feeling that I might start to rush and get confused and overwhelmed, then I know here that every single part of my painting is going to be allocated the right amount of attention and time. Now, something else to be aware of when you are blending acrylics is that that colour that you're blending might potentially cause another area to be adjusted. So I will have to come back at the end of this painting and actually darken up around the eye. One thing that has happened here is as I am blending, it's created a little bit of that hazy look over the darker values, especially around the eye, as I say, and that there has actually made the eye look smaller. This isn't a mistake, this is just something that we need to be paying attention to in our paintings, because the way that we're using this makeup brush, which of course is larger than the brushes we're using for the paint, it will sometimes make that paint go over an area that we might not necessarily anticipate. And as long as we are working with that awareness that we have the flexibility with acrylics, there's no mistake here that we can't fix. Just coming back in with that darker mixture and then adding the shadows, that definition around the eye. At the moment, I'm focusing more on the shine and getting those highlights in place. When the bulk of that blending process is done, then I can start to consider more of those top details. So for this, I have switched over to a much smaller brush. This little detailed brush is enabling me to be very refined now with the paint that I'm applying. But you'll see that I'm still using a damp filbert brush to soften those edges. I don't want these details to be so harsh that they're then distracting. When I'm working with these details, this is where I'm now adjusting those highlights, those contrasts yet again. But in order to make these look realistic, I have to make sure that the layers underneath are dark enough. Now, this is a common problem that we can run into. If we are working with titanium white, which I currently am here, this can't go any brighter. If these highlights weren't showing up, that would be a clear indication that my layers underneath aren't dark enough. So in order to make this look wet, I have to make sure here that the layers are dark enough for my foundation and that the areas in between, those midtones, are not too light. Making sure that we've got the right balance of shadows, midtones and highlights mean that those brightest top details are going to stand out. If the layers are too light, then the painting's going to look flatter and more two-dimensional. And just because I add those brighter highlights, it doesn't necessarily say that I call it finished. Once I added those details, I felt like I still needed to adjust the colour. So I'm actually coming in with a little bit of burnt sienna at times to get a bit of that warmer sunlit glow to the reflections on the water and also the very top, the shinier part of the dolphin. Making sure here that I've got a little bit of that colour of the surrounding over both areas, the subject and the background, again helps just to pull everything here together. The other thing as well is this is very individual. Because this is a wildlife painting that I'm doing for myself, if I did decide that I wanted more of those sunset colours, I could pull in a lot more of that colour saturation to the dolphin. There really is no right or wrong here, but the contrast does need to be right. You want to make sure that you've got your shadows dark enough and your highlights bright enough. That really is something here that can be a game changer when working with realism. And regarding contrast, something here that is also can be very simplified with the use of glazes is if we do realise that a layer is not dark enough, we don't have to start that area again either. We can work with a glaze that's thin enough. You do want to make sure that it's transparent enough, but you can add that darker colour over an area and it's still not completely cover up the layer underneath. And this really is something to pay attention to regarding the consistency of the paint, the colours that you're using. You don't want that mixture to be too opaque because then it's going to cover up everything beneath it. So getting that balance right, the consistency right, it is very, very important. But you certainly wouldn't have to paint this over again if you did feel like your layers underneath weren't dark enough. Even when you got to a mid-stage, If you felt like your base foundation wasn't dark enough, you could work with a glaze to do that. It's easier to adjust this earlier on in your painting, so as soon as you notice that something needs to be darker, put down those detailed brushes, go back to darkening it, and then add your details back over the top. Because once we're committed more with details, it can be a little bit harder for us to get in that mindset of covering up those finer additions to those layers. So the sooner we make those adjustments, the better. So I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I do also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you are interested in painting along to the real-time version of this Dolphin tutorial, I will link all of the information to that in the description below. If you have any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. I'm always happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week. But as always, thank you so much for watching.